In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren helped craft a 9-0 decision in the landmark desegregation case Brown v. Board of Education, ensuring that this momentous change to American society would have the imprimatur of a united Supreme Court. But it's hard to imagine today's rigidly divided, highly politicized court agreeing unanimously in an opinion on an equally controversial issue: abortion rights, for example. It has become commonplace to talk about Republican and Democratic justices, and to assume in advance that they will line up on any given issue with the party whose president nominated them. But sometimes, as with Donald Trump, the president was elected by a minority of the country, and while public attitudes change with the times, the justices often do not. With a 5-4 conservative majority seemingly locked in for decades to come, the court could find itself far to the right of the country on a number of issues. Commentators say a knockdown battle over every open seat is demoralizing for the country and cements the growing perception of the court as a political body. Roosevelt's gambit has been cited by Republicans who oppose adding justices. There have been a number of Supreme Court reform proposals discussed over the years, but the one most often cited by Democratic candidates in this cycle has come from law professors Ganesh Sitaraman and Daniel Epps, How to Save the Supreme Court, which will be published in the Yale Law Journal later this year. Sitaraman, who teaches at Vanderbilt and previously served as Senator Elizabeth Warren's policy director, explained the two options outlined in their plan to NewsPulse News. The idea is that if justices are rotated among a pool 20 times as large as the current one, the battle over individual confirmations will become less intense. The plan, which has been floated by Senator Bernie Sanders, would also be a throwback to the first century of the court, where until 1891 judges pulled double duty on both the circuit and Supreme Courts. Would either of the How to Save the Supreme Court plans hold up to legal challenges? Our goal is that these are not constitutionally bulletproof, but they are constitutionally credible and plausible arguments, said Sitaraman, who added that the plans weren't meant to be implemented together and instead should be seen as two separate options to consider. We don't claim to have found the perfect solution, said Epps, who co-wrote the proposal and teaches law at Washington University in St. Louis. We are less wedded to the exact details of our proposals than we are to the idea that we need to start thinking creatively about ways to design a Supreme Court system that at least makes some sense for the world we live in today and that doesn't put too much power in the hands of individual people and make too much depend on what are seemingly random events. Considering McConnell's work at locking in a conservative judiciary for decades to come, it is unrealistic to expect that Republicans will be interested in breaking their own hold on the system. This means it would be up to Democrats to both take the White House and find 51 votes in the Senate willing to change a system that's been in place since the Ulysses S. Grant administration. But some activists on the left are encouraged that there's even a discussion, besides Sanders, Buttigieg, and O'Rourke, Senators Warren, Kamala Harris and Kirsten Gillibrand all expressed an openness to expanding the Supreme Court in comments to Politico last month. In his messaging, Buttigieg initially tried to paint the move in nonpartisan terms but earlier this week referenced McConnell's blockage of Garland as precedent in an MSNBC interview earlier this week. Buttigieg made the point that by blocking a replacement for Scalia, McConnell had in effect created an 8-person court. Critics of court packing have pointed to other countries where an expansion of the top court is seen as a way for an autocratic leader to consolidate power. If Democrats were to make a serious push at this, expect to hear Republicans cite Hugo Chávez's 2004 expansion in Venezuela. Hungary's right-wing Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has also consolidated his power in the courts over the last few years. There is also a concern that adding judges could just result in escalating constitutional hardball and potentially a delegitimization of the court, a scenario in which states begin ignoring rulings with which they disagree. It's also likely that Roberts would be a critic of the plan, as he's attempted to defend both the legitimacy of his court and his eventual legacy as Chief Justice while pushing back on the idea that the court's ideological divisions drive its opinions. Unfortunately for Roberts, the current president has undercut his attempts at promoting neutrality. "We're going to have great judges, conservative, all picked by the Federalist Society, Trump told a group of evangelical Christian leaders in 2016, referring to the conservative group that has focused for decades on moving the courts right. "If it's my judges," Trump promised, "you know how they're gonna decide, and if it's Hillary Clinton's judges, you also know how they're gonna decide."